Hi, I want to welcome you and thank you for streaming this message today. I'm really glad that you joined us. At Bailey Christian Church, it matters to us that you feel welcomed, like that this is family. Whether you're young or not so young, my hope is that you'll encounter Jesus, and that as you encounter Jesus, you'll find encouragement to live a life of faith for Him. If you're new with us today, I would love if you wouldn't mind filling out the Connect card that is linked here, or going to baileychristianchurch.com and letting us know who you are, if you have any questions that we can follow up with, or even if you have a prayer concern and you'd like somebody to pray for you, we'd love to know so that we can connect with you. If you're in the area sometime, in the Bailey area, we'd love to have you join us in person. And the reason I invite you into that is because we're called not just to experience a message, but actually to live a life of faith in the context of community. And so we'd love for you to be a part of what's happening here at Bailey. And if you want to know more about how you can get plugged in to what's happening here, again, go back to baileychristianchurch.com, check things out, and if we can help you, we would love to follow up with you as well. I hope today that you're blessed through this message. When my kids were growing up, I remember reading the book, and some of you kids will remember or know this book, maybe read it recently, is Alexander and the Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Day. Love that story. Maybe some of you saw the movie. And it's a story about a kid where just nothing goes his way that day, and he just is feeling it, and he's miserable, and he thinks the whole world is against him. And my guess is that all of us have had those kinds of days where it seemed like nothing lined up in our favor. Everything seemed to be against us, and maybe it was not our fault at all. Maybe stuff just happened to us, and it just came our way. But sometimes things happen to us that aren't so great because we make some bad choices. Sometimes we do things that end up having consequences to them. For some people, it's they stayed up too late the night before and with their friends, and they slept through the alarm and end up failing the test. Somebody messed up at work and got fired. Sometimes a person will say something to a friend that's unkind about somebody else, only to find out that that friend went and told that other friend, and those friendships are no longer the same. Or maybe it's we lied about something that happened, and then it got found out, and we got even in more trouble because we didn't tell the truth. So all of this led to consequences. And so for some of us, a bad day is a result of bad decisions. Well, in the book Ezekiel that we're going to be looking at, Ezekiel is going to have one of those times. But it won't be because of things that he did necessarily, but because of things that other people had done that were bad and that there were consequences for. But Ezekiel doesn't just have a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day. He has a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad year and then some. I mean, it's not just a day. It just lasts day after day after day. And here's the thing. The reason he's going to be going through that is because God has called him to do it. God has told him to go through this miserable year. And as we're going to see, it's not because God didn't like Ezekiel. He actually loves Ezekiel. But he chose Ezekiel as a prophet to do some actions like the charades that we were doing a little while ago with the kids, that would tell a story of just how upset God was for the many bad things that his people Israel had done for so long in disobeying him. But he didn't just tell Ezekiel to say words. He had him play, not so much play a game, but to do these actions, these charades, so to speak, so that each day God's people would see him acting this out, and they would have to wonder, what's he saying? What's he trying to get across? What's the message? So this morning, we're going to cover a lot of territory. We're going to take a look at, not in great detail every chapter, but chapters 4 through 7. And so if you want to follow along on your insert this morning or on the app, I invite you to do that. And we're going to just explain some things. And if you've read this already, some of you have started on the reading plan. If you haven't, go ahead and go out to the hub or even on the app, and you can find the reading plan for this series. That'll help you get ready. In fact, if anything, probably what's going to happen when you read through Ezekiel, it will confuse you, and hopefully then you come on Sunday and you go, oh, that's what that's about. But that may be what you're feeling right now. Where's this thing going to go? So take a look at your insert. The thing that God is asking of Ezekiel, some scholars called a sign act. There was a sign to the actions that he was doing. And here's what they mean. He was acting out the prophecy like charades. Now, prophecy is God is going to speak through him as a prophet, somebody who speaks to the people on behalf of God to warn them, to wake them up, to tell them what God wants from them. And so that sign conveyed the message, and then later Ezekiel's words would explain the sign further and what it meant. So he's going to do these actions day after day after day, and then eventually God's going to open his mouth and let him explain it. But before he gets to the words, they have to day after day after day watch him go through this. So let's take a look at the first part, chapter 4, opening in the first verse. We see the very first of these acts that he's called to do. It says, "Now, son of man, take a block of clay, put it in front of you, and draw the city of Jerusalem on it. Then lay siege to it. Erect siege works against it. Build a ramp up to it. Set up camps against it, and put battering rams around it. Then take an iron pan and place it as an iron wall between you and the city, and turn your face toward it. It will be under siege, and you shall besiege it. This will be a sign to the people of Israel." So the first thing that God tells him to do is to do something that kids do almost every day after school. They go out to the sandbox. When you're little, I think of as a little boy of setting up a little city, and we have water, and then, or maybe a battle, and armies are coming against each other, and you're picking each other off, and so he's set to build this city, so to speak, that is reminiscent of Jerusalem, and he's called to enact a battle. And so you understand, each of the different things that God is going to do through Ezekiel is a sign pointing to the siege of Jerusalem by Babylon. Now, Babylon has already taken over Jerusalem, but it hasn't destroyed Jerusalem yet. That's still yet to come. And so God is telling through Ezekiel that the day is going to come when it's actually going to be fully wiped out. And he's going to talk about the suffering of the people of God in Jerusalem and the ones that are taken into exile and are sent out to other places. After he tells him to take this brick, there's some other things that he tells him to do. And so there are three kind of key actions. There's multiple actions in the midst of them, but three primary ones. And the first is this. Ezekiel lays down on the job. God's going to call him to lay down on the job. And the first thing he does before he has to lay down is he takes this brick. Now, this brick probably would have been not like a smaller modern brick. You think of brick houses today. Well, bricks back then were much larger, or like more like a block, or rectangular brick, or even a small tablet. It's probably, while it was still soft, so it would have been not baked yet. And so maybe using his fingernail or a stick, he draws an outline of the city of Jerusalem. And it's possible that at this time, as the people are seeing him draw this, now I don't know where this is happening. Maybe it's outside his front door. Maybe it's inside and people are coming into the house. What you're going to see is this is probably going to become like a tourist spot. And people from the exiles in Babylon are going to be coming day in and day out to watch what the prophet is doing. And it may be that they assume that what he's doing is he's drawing their experience. They were exiled. Babylon came in, took over the city, and took them out. And maybe they were hoping that the final part of this would be that God was there to save his people. But that's not what's going to happen. In fact, take a look at your insert. Ezekiel actually plays the part of Yahweh, or God. That's the Hebrew name for God here. See, maybe they're happy at first thinking that as he's representing God going to come down and save his people and deliver them and restore them back to Israel. But what they don't understand is, as Christopher Wright puts it, that Yahweh is not inside the city defending it. Yahweh is outside the city attacking it. So this is not the kind of prophecy they're wanting to hear. This is not the kind of word from God that they're wanting to hear. They're in exile in Babylon because they've been unfaithful to God. Take a look at your insert again. Here's what this act symbolizes. It symbolizes Israel's judgment. Israel is being finally judged for all the things that God had warned them not to do. All the way back to Deuteronomy, he told them, you need to be faithful to this covenant, and if you're not, these are the things that will happen. You need to be faithful to this commitment, this agreement, this relationship, and this is the blessing that will come your way. But if you don't, these are the consequences. So the second thing is this act symbolizes Israel's destruction, and it's going to get worse. And this act symbolizes here that God is the enemy of Israel, which doesn't make sense to them because they're God's chosen people. How could God be our enemy? Well, let's continue on. Verse 4. God says to Ezekiel, then lie on your left side and put the sin of the people of Israel upon yourself. You are to bear their sin for the number of days you lie on your side. I have assigned you the same number of days as the years of their sin. And so for 390 days you will bear the sin of the people of Israel. After you have finished this, lie down again, this time on your right side, and bear the sin of the people of Judah. I have assigned you 40 days, a day for each year. Turn your face toward the siege of Jerusalem, and with bared arm prophesy against her. I will tie you up with ropes so that you cannot turn from one side to the other until you have finished the days of your siege. Let's just take a look at this next slide. I think it's a picture. Is there a picture? Yeah. This is one artist's rendition of what that might have looked like. And God is telling him he's going to lay on his side. Can you imagine laying on only one side for a year? I mean, he's going to get up occasionally throughout the day, but that's something he has to do. He doesn't have a sleep number bed. He doesn't have a Posturepedic, one of those purple things. I mean, he's laying on hard ground on one side for a year. So I want you to think of the physical pain that must have put him through. But I want you to think of the emotional and spiritual pain of what he is enacting, of what he's bearing. Let's take a look at the insert again. Let's kind of break this down. So as he's laying on his side, Ezekiel is called to bear the weight of Israel's sin. He takes on this image almost like he is a sacrifice that's offered at the temple. When a sacrifice is offered at the temple, particularly on the Day of Atonement, the high priest would lay hands on a scapegoat. They'd have two of them. One would be chosen, and they would confess the sins of Israel on that scapegoat. And then that scapegoat was offered as a sacrifice, and the blood was taken into the Holy of Holies, and it was put on the Ark of the Covenant as a way of making things right, of atoning for sin, making things right, God cleansing and forgiving. And so the priest goes in on behalf of the people, and then he comes back out on behalf of God, and he declares forgiveness. But the other neat part of the scapegoat is there was another scapegoat where the sins were confessed upon, and that scapegoat was left to go out into the wilderness. And as I'm told, there would be maybe various priests or other people working in the temple who were allowed to go out, kind of be markers along the way, until the very last one could not see the scapegoat any further as it was left out in the wilderness. And then word would make its way back to the people as a declaration, it's gone. Your sin is gone. We can't see it anymore. It was a visible reminder, a visible blessing for God's people that they were forgiven. And so take a look at your next thing. Here's what he's doing. This is a priestly action. He's kind of taking their place, so to speak, offering a sacrifice. Remember, Ezekiel comes from a priestly family. He was 30 when he first heard from God, which would have been the year he would have become a priest. But he's not in Jerusalem, so he can't be a priest in Jerusalem like he would have always planned. But he's acting out sort of a priestly role. And in this case, Ezekiel also plays the part of Israel. So before, he's playing the part of God. Now he's playing the part of Israel in this act. In fact, as a priest, both would be true. As a priest, like I said a moment ago, the priest represents the people to God and prays for their forgiveness and offers up sacrifices, and then comes back to the people on behalf of God and declares forgiveness back to the people. But here's what's different this time. Ezekiel doesn't carry their sin off. He will not carry it away as a substitute, but he reveals there's no substituting for their sin this time. There is nothing that is going to stop what God is going to do. What a message. Take a look at your insert again. Because for 390 years or 390 days for Ezekiel, he had to endure this and continue to live out this charade, this mime. Now, the 390 days or 390 years are likely referred to the date of completion of the temple. When under Solomon, when Solomon built this beautiful temple that God had blessed and filled with his presence. Basically saying this, that throughout that time, God's people, all of them, unfaithfulness was there. There were good things and great things that were happening at times that God did, but the direction of the people of God was unfaithful from its earliest days. And so it represents, this is next on your insert, it represents the sinful rebellion of the whole nation from its early days. You say, I mean, like how bad we're talking here? Murder, cheating, worshiping idols, false gods, not bowing down to the one true God. By the time the end of Judah in the south, in Jerusalem, Manasseh, one of the kings was offering up. So you have these guys offering up their son on behalf of the gods to appease the gods, sacrificing their children. That's how bad it had gotten in Israel. But what's the 40 years or 40 days? Well, that's likely a round number. When people talk about a generation, what's a generation? About 40 years. So 40 is an important number throughout the Bible. 40 days, 40 years of wilderness wandering. But this is likely to reflect a generation. In other words, a period of generation. And it is this generation of Judah that is going to die. This generation that was taken from Jerusalem in this area into exile, mostly Judah, is going to experience this exile. Is going to experience this judgment. But now, guys, the story gets really exciting because next, Ezekiel eats poop, sort of. Go ahead to the next slide here. You'll see a different slide in a second, but let's read this. Just stay with me for a moment. Actually, you're going, I can't do anything else now. Now you've said poop, so I'm focused. They tell you in Bible college, never say that sort of thing from the pulpit. And I've said, blame God, because this is what God is going to say here. Take wheat and barley, beans and lentils, millet and spelt, put them in a storage jar and use them to make bread for yourself. You are to eat it during the 390 days you lie on your side. Weigh out 20 shekels of food to eat each day and eat it at set times. Also measure out 1/6 of a hin of water and drink it at set times. Eat the food as you would a loaf of barley bread. Bake it in the sight of the people using human excrement for fuel. I think the translators felt that was a better word for what I just said. The Lord said, in this way the people of Israel will eat defiled food among the nations where I will drive them out, or I'll drive them to. And then I said, not so, sovereign Lord. So here Ezekiel goes, time out. That's a bridge too far. Lord, I have never defiled myself from my youth until now. I have never eaten anything found dead or torn by wild animals. He's saying, as a faithful Jewish priest, I have never eaten anything that was not to be eaten from. And one of them was, you're not to eat from that. You're not to eat stuff that is tainted in any way, and excrement was tainted. No impure meat has ever entered my mouth. And so here's what God does. He says, very well, I will let you eat your bread baked over cow dung instead of human excrement. Thanks. So this is the next slide here, I think. There we go. Hey, just take a look at your inserts here. These kids will grow up and go, you remember that sermon 20 years ago? Defiled food. Look at your insert again. The reason I say it the way I said it was because in the ancient world, and this is on your inserts, barley cakes could often be baked on the coals themselves. Thus, you heat up the excrement. There are coals that come from it. You're baking right on top of, not a nice little griddle over the top, but right on it. In other words, it would have touched it. And so this was done to symbolize from God's behalf that Israel will eat food in unclean lands of exile. He's trying to help them see, and you can imagine the word getting around, and they go, you got to go see what the prophet's doing, man. In other words, he's trying to help them understand this is Israel, and this is what's going to happen, because they're going to end up having to eat in defiled lands where food's not going to be prepared the correct way, and they're going to be living in defiled places because of their unfaithfulness. Now, we've already highlighted this, but God in his mercy, however, allows him to use cow dung. Now, in some countries, even today, dried cow dung is used as an element for heating. It is actually still used at times. But that was a lesser thing on his behalf, and so God makes a concession so that Ezekiel can live with himself for the next year and better. But here's what's important too. Look at the amount. It's a really small amount that he's going to get to eat daily. So the bread is just enough to make about 230 grams, or about 8 ounces per loaf. It's just a little bit. That's all he's going to eat every day. It's a good thing he's laying down because he's not going to have much energy. And look at the water. It's about 0.6 liters, which would keep a strong 30-year-old alive, but at starvation level. Christopher Wright says, can you imagine? I imagine his wife going out, eat something, Ezekiel. He's got, I can't. And she's watching her husband waste away. And she's probably going, can I have my pan back that you used earlier? See, this is a symbol of those in Jerusalem who will starve in the siege. In other words, God is saying, Ezekiel, I'm going to allow you to experience as a model, as an action of what's going to happen to my people when they're taken into captivity. And they will be looking at themselves as they look at you. And they'll be seeing, hopefully, and getting the message clearly of what's going on. Look at verse 16. And then he said to me, Son of man, I am about to cut off the food supply in Jerusalem. The people will eat rationed food in anxiety and drink rationed water in despair, for food and water will be scarce. And they will be appalled at the sight of each other, and they will waste away because of their sin. This is a hard word. And God is, through Ezekiel, trying to get it across to his people that this is why what's happening to you and what's yet to happen will be bad. But God calls him to do another thing. Not only to lie down on the job, but he calls Ezekiel to get a close shave. Get a close shave. Take a look at verse 5. Now, son of man, this is verse 5 of chapter 5, verse 1. Now, son of man, take a sharp sword and use it as a barber's razor to shave your head and your beard. Now, Christopher Wright says, typically slaves and exiles don't get to have sharp swords around because those usually mean rebellion of some sort. So how he got a hold of one, we're not sure exactly, but somehow he was able to get something. And when the days of your siege, or he said, then take a set of scales and divide up the hair. When the days of your siege come to an end, burn a third of the hair inside the city. So this is after the lying down, after the 390 days and 40 days. He's called to do this. And take a third and strike it with a sword all around the city. And scatter a third to the wind, for I will pursue them with drawn sword. But take a few hairs and tuck them away in the folds of your garment. Again, take a few of these and throw them into the fire and burn them up. A fire will spread from there to all of Israel. What's the deal with the hair? What's going on? Well, let's take a look at it again. The sword is really key. The sword symbolizes God's judgment on Israel for failing in its priestly role. I'll help you unpack the idea of the priestly role here in just a moment. What does the shaving represent? Well, number one, shaving was not to be done by priests. Priests were told, do not shave your beard, do not shave your head. It is a shame. So God is in essence asking of Ezekiel, I want you to step down from the priesthood. You're visibly before all the people going to have to shave. And can you imagine, do you know what your face looks like, guys, after you've had a beard for a long time with a nice razor? He's hacked up. It had to take forever. It couldn't have felt good. And in their culture, it was so much more than just a close shave. See, number two, shaving is associated with extreme mourning. When people were going through distress and they were grieving, they would shave themselves as a symbol of just kind of being willing to be embarrassed and ashamed for all the terrible things going on. Shaving was associated with humiliation and shame and disgrace. Here's what Ezekiel does. Look at your next slide. Ezekiel acts out both parts. In other words, the hand that wields the sword is God's hand. So he's called to play the role of Yahweh again. But Ezekiel and his beard are Israel. And God is the one putting him through this. What's happening here? If, in fact, then, Ezekiel represents not only Israel, but the priestly role that he was. But you have to understand, Israel was also called to be, God's goal was for Israel to become a kingdom of priests. And what did priests do? We mentioned earlier, priests go to God on behalf of others, in this case the world, and they go back to the world on behalf of God to proclaim his truth and his message. Israel no longer is a priest to the nations, is what he's saying. Israel has lost its role. Israel has forfeited in this instance. That's why they're being judged. They have neglected being the witness to the world that they were called to be. And so every time the people saw this bedraggled man who was skinny and gaunt from starvation, and now he's shaved clean, what an embarrassment. They were seeing themselves. But what God's going to do here is he's going to use their judgment as a witness to the nations. Now let's go back to what are the things he does with the hair? Well, he weighs it out. Weighing it out was a symbol of judgment. Your life is being weighed out. A third of it is taken and thrown into the fire. In other words, when sieges happened and cities were destroyed, that was often part of it. It was destroyed by fire and other things. And then a third of it would be spread out by the sword and around. In other words, those that escape are going to be cut down by the sword. Another third will be just kind of scattered about and thrown to the wind. In other words, they'll be taken into captivity in other places. And then he says, and then I want you to take a little smidgen and tuck it into your garment. What's that all about? Take a look at your next line in your insert. That's hope. That's a remnant. And even some of the remnant's going to end up in the fire. Some of the remnant's not going to make it through because they don't quite get it yet. But the remnant that God is saying is, I'm bringing this upon my people so that I can purify them. And some will come back and say, guys, we must never forget why we went through that. We must always remember that God is God. And so God is saying, I will raise up a remnant from my people who will come back. But let's ask the question. Some of you are probably already asking this question. Doesn't this seem a little bit like overkill? I mean, really? It's talking major destruction, people dying. Is God just impatient? Well, first of all, I want you to understand, we're talking, he's 390 years. I mean, we're talking generations and generations of patience on God's behalf. But maybe there's something that we don't always get. I think Colin Smith puts it well. He addresses the issue of God's judgment and eternal destruction in particular. And he says, you may say, wait a minute, how can any sin deserve everlasting destruction? If God is just, how can he punish like this? Well, the best answer I have ever heard, he said, to that question was given by a friend of mine who was a middle school pastor. And he outlined the stages of the following scenario. So suppose a middle school student punches another student in class. What happens? Student's given detention. You would hope, in some places that's not the case, but anyway, generally speaking, detention. 2. Suppose during detention, this boy punches the teacher. What happens then? He gets suspended. Suppose on the way home, the same boy punches a policeman in the nose. What happens? Ends up in jail. Suppose some years later, the very same boy is in a crowd waiting to see the President of the United States, and the President passes by, and the boy lunges to punch the President. What happens? He might not make it out of that alive. And then Smith says, in every case, the crime is precisely the same, but the severity of the crime is measured by the one against whom it is committed. What comes from sinning against God, who is eternal and almighty and creator of all and all loving, is destruction. You see, sometimes we diminish our sin because we think, well, is it really all that bad? Why would God really get that upset? Understand that in God's economy, in God's sense, that when we sin against the God of all creation, and in this case, go totally opposed to him, not just a daily sin, but something that is totally heading in the other direction, it is cosmic treason. This is not just sin on a little scale. This is ultimate sin. Who else is there to pay for it? But let's ask this question. What is God's primary criticism of Israel? Why is he so upset? Look at chapter 5, verse 5. This is what the sovereign Lord says. This is Jerusalem, which I have set in the center of the nations. And this is really key here, with countries all around her. Now, he doesn't mean geographically, per se. He means symbolically, that Jerusalem is the city on the hill meant to be seen by all the other nations. Yet in her wickedness, she has rebelled against my laws and decrees more than the nations and countries around her. She's worse than those nations. She has rejected my laws and has not followed my decrees. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. You have been more unruly than the nations around you and have not followed my decrees or kept my laws. Listen to what he says next. You have not even conformed to the standards of those nations around you. You did it one worse. They all had standards, and you didn't even abide by their standards. You went beyond even theirs. Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I myself am against you, Jerusalem, and I will inflict punishment on you in the sight of the nations. This is not a word God's people are used to hearing. Because over and over again in the Old Testament, even when at times they've been unfaithful, God says, do not fear, for I am with you. I'm with you. But 14 times in Ezekiel has God saying, I'm against you. That's huge. A corner has been turned. Nothing is going to stop this from happening. And so the real enemy of Jerusalem is not Babylon or not the Babylonians, it's God now. Take a look at your insert. What's happening here? The thing that God is highlighting is that Israel has been unfaithful to her commitment to God. They've been unfaithful to him. They committed to him and they've gone back. Israel has been unfaithful to her role to be a witness to the nations and to point them to the one true God. That's key. He said, I put you in the middle of all the nations so that you would be an example, not so that you'd keep all the blessings to yourselves, but going back to Genesis 12 through Abram, God says, you are blessed to be a blessing. You are to be a light, a lighthouse to the world, to show as a priest, you're to go to the world on my behalf, and you have failed that role. Why is God so upset with them, though? Because they knew better. Kids, have you ever had your mom or dad get really upset with you about something? And your immediate reaction is to point to your younger brother or sister or the neighbor or something. You know, they did it too. Yeah. And then what do they say? Yeah, but you know better. I mean, it's one thing to do something by accident and not know any better. But when you know, I just got done telling you not to do that. There's a higher consequence there because you know what you should do. In the New Testament, Jesus even says that the servant who is punished, the servant who knows what he's supposed to do is punished with more lashes. The servant who doesn't know is still punished, but he does not punish with as much lashes because he doesn't know any better. God's people knew better. All right, with all this said, and you go, well, where's the good news in this? Is there any hope in this? Yes. Let's take some time here just to wrap this up. Where's the good message? Number one is God is faithful to his word. Now you go, well, yeah, but I don't like what he's faithful to. But he's faithful. Here's why this matters. That you know that what God says, he's going to do. Number two, he's just. Now, as hard as this seems, this is exactly what we want. We know there is right and wrong. We can't live in a world where there is no justice. Even when we're little kids and our brother gets a bigger piece of cake than we do, it's unfair. There's something wrong about this, not just. And nobody has to teach us that. We just internally know that there needs to be justice in this world until it comes to us. I want to get mad at the person who cuts me off in traffic. But how dare somebody get mad at me? Don't they know I had to cut in here? I had to do this. I have an explanation for this. They, however, there's something wrong in the head. I mean, so we have this way of being able to distance ourselves from our own inadequacies. But here's the other thing about God. He's gracious. In fact, if he's not just, there's no grace. You have to understand those two have to go together. God has to be holy in order for his grace and his mercy to make any sense. If God is like a doting grandparent that just looks the other way and says, they're there, that's boys will be boys, it's not a big deal. Take a look at the cities in our nation where that's exactly what's going on. Any of you want to live in those cities? Where there are no true consequences to anything? I mean, just heard the other day about a city where it was I don't know if it was a mayor, it was somebody who was a representative in that area who got mugged and carjacked and was part of one of those that was basically trying to do away with some of the policing and so forth. And immediately said, these young people, they need to pay consequences. This is not okay. Exactly. Because then it sends a message to the rest of the world and to the rest of the community that some things are right and some things are wrong. In fact, take a look at the last point here. God will use even judgment to point people to truth and to hope. In other words, by God being true to his word to Israel, that if you do these things, I will come back to you. Just as I have judged other nations, I will judge you if you turn from me. Guess what kind of message that sends to the nations around Israel? If that's what God does to the ones that are the apple of his eye, what do you think he's going to do to us if we don't get our lives right with him? In other words, it becomes it becomes a wake-up call to all nations, to all people. Some things are right, some things are wrong. There are consequences to be paid. Some things will happen if we don't follow this one true God. Let's take a look at that last line. And here's what I want to call us to today. God wants us to be reminded of our role today to be a light to the world, pointing to Him as well. Persistent and unrepentant sin causes God to respond. He is just, He is holy, He is greater than, but He is loving and kind. And if we will repent, He is gracious. Let's look at one last section here, verses 8 and following. But I will spare some, for some of you will escape the sword when you are scattered among the lands and nations, and then in the nations where you have been carried captive, those who escape will remember me. Now how I have been grieved by their adulterous hearts, they will come back to me, which I have turned away from, and they have turned away from me, and by their eyes which have lusted after their idols. And they will loathe themselves for the evil they have done and for all their detestable practices. And then verse 10, and they will know that I am the Lord. I did not threaten in vain to bring this calamity on them. I'm a God of my word. As we come to communion, still going through some of our minds might be, but is this fair? Well, I want you to understand that God is just, and so we need a just God in order for anything to, we need a standard in order for anything to make sense. And for God to truly be God, He can't just simply overlook that things need to be paid. Penalties need to be paid for unfaithfulness. But maybe the question rises up in the midst of all this, and it may not be putting it this way, but it's a good question, is where is God in the midst of the suffering then in all of this? Where's the God in the midst of the suffering of all the world and the evil that exists in the world? Where is God? And guess what we get to say as a Christian? He's on the cross. In other words, the God of all creation, who is loving and true and holy and just, enters into our pain and into our suffering, and He's not at a distance from it. He actually shares it, and not only does He share in our pain and our suffering, He actually takes our sin upon Himself in order to make atonement, to make things right between us and the Father. Where is God in the midst of our suffering? He's on the cross, and He's telling us two things. He's telling us just how bad sin is, but He's also telling us just how much He loves us. That's the God we have. This morning as we come to communion, I want you to realize that our sin really is that serious, but that God's love is that much greater. As you look to Jesus this morning. If you're with us this morning, you have to be a member here, but if you're a Christian, we welcome you to the table. We welcome you to share with us. And as the trays are passed, go ahead and take the cups and spend some time in prayer and encountering this God, this Jesus. And then go ahead and put those cups in the holders in front of you. Let's pray. Jesus, we're reminded of just how much You love us. But we're also reminded of how holy and true and just You are. And so I pray that we would not diminish our sin. We come to You even now, if there's sin that we've pushed to the side, may our eyes be open to it. May You even now wash us clean as we come to the table. That we might walk away refreshed. We might walk away in truth and in grace and in love as we bear witness to You this week. It's in Your name, Jesus, we pray. Amen.
Hey, I'm Joel Malone, one of the elders here at Bailey Christian Church. We are so glad you joined us online today. Thank you for streaming on whatever platform you're using. Just remember to drop us a note and let us know that you are here and watching, and we would love to have you visit us in person sometime. Our doors are always open. If you have any needs or prayer concerns, just go to our website and check us out there, send us a message, and we'd be happy to be in contact with you. Have a great week.